Welcome to this presentation on Agile Foundations, an introduction on Agile approaches. This is what we will be going through. First of all, a short introduction on what is Agile, then an overview on what Agile approaches exist. Finally, we'll be looking at one of these Agile approaches, which is Scrum. We'll be then having a look at what happens when Agile is mixed with predictive approaches, creating hybrid approaches. And then finally, we'll be wrapping up by looking at the benefits of agility. What do we mean when we talk about Agile? Well, actually, what we're referring to are the adaptive approaches which can be used in specific projects and in specific cases, right? When combining predictive approaches with adaptive approaches, of course, we have hybrid approaches, and predictive approaches instead are the traditional project management plan-based approaches that we are not talking about here in this short video. So let's have a look at what agility actually is. Well, first of all, what does it mean from a very basic level? If what you see in front of you is the flow of a normal project in which you have an understanding of what are the requirements, and then you have a process for delivering those requirements, and finally you hand over the deliverables to a customer, then what would we need to do with this basic flow of work, which is true for anything, predictive or adaptive approaches, in order to make it become an adaptive approach? Well, first of all, the delivery is iterative. So we don't deliver once, we deliver in bursts, which hand over something useful to the customer, receive feedback from the customer that loops back into the work process, and then defines what the next iteration is going to be. And again, we deliver something useful to the customer. Again, we receive feedback from the customer, which feeds back into the work loop, defining what the third loop is going to be, what the third iteration is going to be, and so on by iterations. These iterations can be of different types, right? We can have adaptive iterations, we can have incremental iterations, but the point is we have an iterative delivery. However, just because we have an iterative delivery, we don't actually have an agile approach. In order to have an agile approach, in addition to the iterative delivery, we need to have something that we call the pull mechanism. The pull mechanism, as compared to the push mechanism in traditional predictive approaches, is a mechanism which enables the team that is responsible for the workflow, for the process of doing the work, enables them to decide how and what to pull into the workflow, thereby giving them the authority to be responsible for the workflow and for the bottlenecks throughout the workflow. So this authority to decide what is ready to be able to be worked upon and how much they are able to work on within one iteration, this ability is very important for an agile approach. Without the pull mechanism, without this authority delegated to the team, you can't really have an agile approach. The iterativity of the flow of work is not sufficient in that sense. It needs to be integrated by the pull mechanism. However, in which cases do we want to work in this way as compared to a more traditional approach? Let's have a look at the different possible ways of looking at this. First of all, if you observe here, we have traditional and adaptive approaches. We have them represented by these two triangles. And these two triangles represent, first of all, a traditional approach, which is scope-based. So if scope is your key priority, then of course you might choose a plan-based approach to deliver that scope. And this would be the area for predictive approaches. If scope is your key objective, meaning you have to deliver 100% of the scope for the deliverables to make sense, in that case, if anything changes throughout the arch of the project lifecycle, then of course it will be either your schedule or your budget that will have to adapt. On the other hand, of course, if instead I have a fixed timeline, and that is my main driver, or a fixed budget, right? And that is my main driver for value towards the customer, in that case, my objective will be that of identifying which scope-related elements are most valuable for the customer and deliver those first in order to make sure that I meet my schedule objectives. And thereby, I will be leaving the less valuable scope-related elements towards the end of the project, so that if I am not able to finish 100% of the scope by my deadline, I have the most valuable elements delivered by the deadline, and the less valuable elements are left out or moved over to the next project. And therefore, we have a value-driven approach. And this is what we mean when we say that in a traditional approach we are plan-driven, we are predictive, while in an adaptive approach we are value-driven. It doesn't mean that in a traditional approach we're not interested in value. Of course we are. It simply means that in an adaptive approach, the whole planning is based on prioritizing the most valuable, value-bringing elements and performing those first in order to make sure that they don't get left behind, because we have tight constraints, either of budget, but most commonly of schedule. So this is the difference between traditional and adaptive approaches, and as you can see, it's very different as to when you choose to use which. The different adaptive approaches which exist have been, in 2001, somehow structured, somehow summarized in these 4 values that together generate what was called the Agile Manifesto. Actually, it is the Manifesto for Agile Software Development, right? So it's not the manifesto, which is agile or agile used as a noun. It is the development which was supposed to be agile. And as you can see, these are quite interesting. First of all, they all indicate one element on the left-hand side of the equation, of these 4 equations if you want, that is valued over the element on the right-hand side of the equation. For example, we value in adaptive approaches, we value the individuals, the interactions between the individuals over the processes and the tools that enable that interaction between the individuals. And you will see that this is very important because it will represent the types of leadership that we will choose in these type of contexts. The other 3 values that we have represent, for example, the valuing of a working product, meaning something tangible that we can hand over to our customer, over the documentation which describes that product. Which means, of course, that all the documents relative to what a future product is going to look like are very nice. Doesn't mean we're not going to have them, but being able to deliver even a partial product to the customer in order for them to have a look at it and test it is valued above that. The third value, customer collaboration over the contract negotiation. The idea being that rather than negotiate in detail all the specifications of your contracts with the customers, you would focus on constant collaboration with the customers and understanding what it is they need and how their needs evolve. And thereby, you will understand that reacting to this evolving need, meaning responding to change, is another important element of agility. Therefore, responding to change is valued over following a predetermined plan. The plan needs to adapt to the evolving changes of the customer. The Agile Manifesto, or the Manifesto for Agile Software Development, in addition to these 4 values, which I find are very important for us to understand the philosophy behind agility, also has 12 principles. These 12 principles kind of create a more tangible frame within which to place these 4 values. Here are the first 6 of these principles. Right? For example, I would attract your attention to principle number 4 here, where the developers and the business people, the people who understand the needs of the customer, need to work together daily throughout the project, meaning that they need to have a constant interaction. The work needs to be done together. They need to understand how the needs of the customers evolve, and they need to constantly communicate about it. So, as you can see, a very tangible way of seeing the values that we just went through. Number 3, again, the working product related aspect. Remember how we value the working product over the documentation. So, delivering frequently working product is another principle which is important, thereby making sure that the customer regularly receives something and is able to give feedback on it. I would invite you to come back to these slides and read them if you want to, pausing this video to read the other principles as well. But as you can see, they give a more tangible approach to the 4 values. These are principles 1 to 6, and these are principles 7 to 12. They are 12 principles in all. Here amongst these, I would draw your attention to the principle number 10, simplicity. Right? The idea being that you try to eliminate everything that brings less value to the customer. Therefore, at every stage, both when you are working in the big picture and eliminating the features that are less important, and when you drill down and you're identifying the user stories or the different elements that are less important and eliminating those, and again within the user stories and the tasks, identifying what are those elements that bring most value and working there. This idea, which is borrowed from Lean, is one of the key elements in agility, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done. I find that is a very nice way of putting it. The idea, of course, is not that of doing as little as possible. It's that of identifying clearly what brings value and focusing on that. In any case, I invite you to pause the video here and read the other principles just to know what they are. Now, just before we move to the rest of the content, I'd like to make a little overview of comparison between the traditional approaches and agile approaches, and have a look at which different elements are somehow different between the 2 approaches, right? So, for example, in a predictive approach, obviously being predictive, we have planning up front, while in an agile approach, we have a guideline which constantly evolves throughout the iterations. As the iterations evolve, also our understanding of what is priority evolves. We, in a traditional approach, in order to be able to plan our work, we have a work breakdown structure, and we understand what the different elements of work are that we need to perform and that we will be then deploying to the customer step by step. While in an agile approach, we focus more on features. And by features, what we mean is we focus on what are the value-bringing characteristics which our customer appreciates, and that's what we are breaking down and prioritizing. Change in a predictive approach is managed as an exception, meaning we have a change management process which helps us to manage change, while in an agile approach, change is embedded into the normal iterative process. At every iteration, we are reevaluating the priorities and readjusting our activities that we need to perform according to the priorities. And this is part of the normal process. Thereby, if there is a change, it is absorbed by this normal iteration. In a predictive approach, control coming from the sponsor, then from the project manager over the team, is rather a top-down approach. In Agile, especially in Scrum and in most Agile approaches, this hierarchical approach is simply not there, right? The different members of the team, the different roles, we will see them later on, the Scrum Master, the product owner, the developer team in Scrum, for example, these are peers. These are not in a hierarchical structure, but they are peers. And we'll also see a little bit more about self-organizing team. The progress is in a predictive approach measured against the deliverables, against the progress of the activities that are being done, while in an agile approach it is measured against what we are delivering to the customer as a working product. So the fact that the customer is able to test the actual work as it progresses. Finally, in a predictive approach, requirements are clearly defined at the beginning of the project. At the beginning of the project, we have a negotiation on what the requirements are and on what will be in scope, what will be out of scope. That's what we call the scope statement in a predictive approach. While in an agile approach, requirements are not defined at the beginning of the project and then delivered throughout the project, but they are defined and redefined at every iteration. And therefore, at the beginning of each iteration, we decide what we will be doing in that iteration only. And what will be done in the next iterations is defined at the beginning of the next iterations. So as you can see, there are quite some differences between these two approaches. And if you've never seen an agile team work, it might be a little bit puzzling to imagine how this can actually fit together. But it does fit together. Of course, there's a lot that is said about Agile, which instead is not true at all. And here we have a little summary of myths about agility, right? Agility is not a silver bullet which can fix all your problems. Agility is not necessarily a methodology. We can call it a method, we can call it a technique, but it's certainly not a methodology, right? It's not a really quick way to get everything done. It's not about compromising controls or having no overview over what is being done. It doesn't necessarily do things quicker. It does help us meet our deadlines, but only in the sense that it helps us focus on the value-bringing elements. It is also not necessarily cheaper, and it certainly does not mean giving up any documentation. It can be used also beyond IT, right? And it's certainly not anarchy, right? And it's certainly not, hey, I have no idea when we'll be finished, or no, we don't need any reporting, right? These are definitely not what Agile is about. You will see that also in agility we have reporting structures. And simply having one daily meeting is not being agile. It's just having a daily meeting, right? In any case, so there's a lot of myths out there. Careful to know what you're talking about. So let's move on to the next page or the next chapter in our presentation. A little overview of the agile methods. What type of methods exist? By far the most well-known, of course, is Scrum. Kanban is another very well-known approach which derives from manufacturing as well as Lean, for example, and also a very interesting approach. Then there are some approaches which are more typical of IT, while Scrum and Kanban can really be used in many different areas. Extreme programming, for example, or the dynamic systems development method, DSDM. These are typical of IT. And of course, we have possible hybrid solutions. There are hybrids of different agile approaches, but what we mean by hybrid solutions here is really hybrids between agile and predictive approaches, and we'll be seeing some of them later. In particular, of course, we will be looking at Scrum a little bit more in detail to understand what it means. However, before we move to Scrum, I'd like to look at a few key characteristics that exist in agile approaches, in particular, for example, the leadership-related characteristics in agile approaches. So how is it that leadership evolves in an agile context? There are certainly leadership positions, even though they are not hierarchically recognized in that sense, but they are leadership positions. For example, the product owner or the Scrum Master. These are leadership positions in Scrum. In Kanban, the Scrum Master is often called the Agile Coach, just as much a leadership position. In some cases, especially in hybrid contexts, you end up calling the person kind of coordinating the work the Agile PM, which is sometimes questionable whether or not a PM exists in Agile, but if you are working in hybrid approaches, of course, that can be there. However, no matter what you call them, these different leadership positions have characteristics which are slightly different to traditional approaches. Not that you cannot have these characteristics in traditional approaches. You certainly do have both servant leadership and self-managed teams also in predictive approaches. However, in agile approaches, the difference comes from the fact that the agility isn't really there unless the leadership role is working with these approaches, right? So while in a predictive approach, you still have a project team, you still have a predictive approach, even if leadership doesn't work in this form. In an agile context, instead, the agility aspects of it are simply not there unless these are working to a decent degree. So what are these? Servant leadership and self-managed teams. Let's have a quick look at them. First of all, servant leadership. The idea is that the leader, the team leader, is focusing on providing services to the team rather than focusing on the overall business. Their focus is making sure that the team grows, is able to do the work, has what they need, is eliminating roadblocks, is making sure that the team is able to work efficiently within the context in which they are. This is very necessary in cases in which you have teams of experts, for example, where the team knows perfectly well what they need to do. What they need from the leader is a facilitator that eliminates roadblocks and enables their activities, right? This is a servant leader. And this type of leadership is critical in cases in which there is a peer-to-peer relationship with the developer team, which is typical of an agile approach. As for self-managed teams, I'd like to compare, maybe the easiest way to understand it is really to compare the self-managed teams to hierarchically managed teams, right? And so let's have a look at a few of these different aspects, right? In a hierarchically managed team, what we typically have is traditional management by objectives. So the team has an objective, the individuals have their own individual objectives, and their goal is to meet their objectives as agreed upon with their management. So, for example, the focus is on the objectives. That's the whole point of having the objectives in the first place. In self-managed teams, it makes less sense to have individual objectives because the objectives need to be team-based, right? And the team needs to be able to flexibly adapt these objectives based on the changing requirements of the customer. Therefore, by working together with the customer, they need to regularly adapt to what brings value to the business and to the customer. Therefore, the aim in a hierarchical team is, of course, to meet the objectives that they have, right? To meet the objectives that they have been set. While in a self-managed team, the objective is a moving objective, right? It's a common objective of the whole team, and the objective is to come closer and closer to what brings value to the customer. So as you can see, there's quite a big difference. You can look at also the other ones. There's quite a big difference between a hierarchically managed team and a self-managed team. In the case of a self-managed team, for example, change is a reactive element. When there is a change, we decide how to react to it according to a change management process. While in a self-managed team, the team is constantly noticing what the customer's evolving requirement is and adapting it to the work that they are doing. So as you can see, quite a big difference between these two approaches. Good, let's jump into one specific approach, which is probably the most common one that we will encounter, which is Scrum. Scrum is based upon 3 key tenets. These 3 tenets are the philosophy on which Scrum is based and on which you build the rest of the system. These are, first of all, transparency. The progress of the work needs to be visible to all. As you can see, this completely goes against the idea that there is no reporting. On the contrary, we have dashboards, which we call information radiators, and these are visible to all, and it needs to be completely transparent. The second key tenet is inspection. As you proceed, the work that is being performed needs to be inspected frequently. The deliverables are inspected, but also the product backlog and the priorities of the activities that are still in the backlog need to be frequently inspected. These, by the way, are called artifacts. We'll see that further on. So artifacts need to be inspected frequently in order to evaluate the situation, the current state, and the quality of what is being done, because the goal is that of delivering a constantly improving product. And finally, the third tenet is adaptation, where the idea is that we take the feedback that we gain from the inspection and constantly make changes, introduce new information, adapt to the environment, to evolving ideas. So these 3 tenets represent Scrum and the different approaches that we will see from now on. Transparency, inspection, and adaptation. In which kind of context would these 3 tenets work best? We all agree that they work well across the board, but in which type of contexts does Scrum work best? Well, it works best in relatively small teams. 5 to 8, 9, up to 12. It's a small team. There, Scrum works very well. And this team has certain characteristics. First of all, we don't want teams that are 20% dedicated to one team, 20% dedicated to another project. We want fully dedicated teams, and possibly co-located so that they can collaborate and they can talk to each other. This aspect of co-location is relatively rare. It is more and more common that the teams are not co-located. However, the fact that they are fully dedicated is very, very important. And what characteristics should these teams have? Right? Well, first of all, they should be self-organizing or self-managed. We've talked about these. They should be cross-functional, meaning in the team you should have all the different skill sets that you need in order to be able to build whatever it is that you're delivering. And it's a group of peers. You don't have the boss and his sub-team, another sub-team, but they constantly collaborate together. It's one team. And their deliverables are the responsibility of the whole team, not of the individual with a specific skill set. The delivery team needs to have constant contact with the business person. We saw this in one of the principles. Remember, we talked about it. And this business person should be able to give the team an understanding of what is important and of how the customer's needs are evolving. This typically is the product owner. And the delivery team also needs to have access to all of the other stakeholders, like the customers, the users are very important, and get feedback from them. And finally, the pull mechanism that I talked about earlier needs to work, meaning the team needs to feel they can commit to what they are doing in each sprint. Because the pull mechanism is exactly about that. It's about the team saying what they are ready to do in the next sprint. However, I'm talking about sprints, but I haven't yet described them. Right? The sprints are the iterations in Scrum. So let's have a look at what the iteration actually looks like. So Scrum has sprints that can range between 1 to 4 weeks. Typically, it's about 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. And it's usually a fixed amount. So you decide what the sprint duration is going to be, say 2 weeks, and then it's always 2 weeks. And you have these 2-week iterations that are kind of bursts of work. And because they are bursts of work, they are called sprints. During this burst of work, we have different aspects. First of all, we have different roles, different people involved. The product owner is the person who is in touch with the customer, who's in touch with the business, and who knows what the customer's priorities are. The Scrum Master is the person who knows the Scrum process well and is supporting the team in order to eliminate bottlenecks and to help them go through the Scrum process efficiently. The developer team is the team of people who are actually doing the work. These are the people who are actually creating the value directly for the customer. The flow of work starts with the product backlog, which is owned by the product owner. The product owner decides what's in the product backlog, meaning there's a long list of the work that needs to be done, and this long list of work is prioritized. On the top, you have the most urgent things, the most valuable elements, what brings most value to the customer, and further down, the value decreases. So the team then needs to decide what it is out of the product backlog that they will be performing in each iteration. This is what we call the pull mechanism. And so the team will pull from the product backlog into the sprint backlog those elements that from the top of the product backlog will be performed in the upcoming sprint. And this short list of elements is called the sprint backlog, and it's usually the stories are broken down into tasks that will be performed during the sprint. Finally, they work for 2-3 weeks of the sprint, and at the end, they end up with a product increment that they can hand over to the customer. This product increment is the result of the iteration. These three, product backlog, sprint backlog, and the product increment, are called artifacts. They are the Scrum artifacts. During this sprint, during this iteration, the team has a series of meetings that they need to perform in order to agree on what to do and how to perform it. These meetings in Scrum lingo are called events or ceremonies. And let's have a look at them. The first one is the sprint planning meeting. during the sprint planning meeting, the team decides what will be moved from the product backlog into the sprint backlog, and they perform the work that needs to be done. Then during the sprint itself, we have the daily scrums. Every day during the 2 weeks of the sprint, the team meets for 5-10 minutes. It's also called daily stand-up, and has a quick review of what was done yesterday. What am I going to do today? What do I need in order to proceed? Do I have any problems? And this daily scrum holds the pulse of the sprint, essentially. Towards the end of the sprint, when we reach the end of the sprint review meeting together with the customer is the meeting in which the Scrum team presents the product increment to the customer and delivers the results. And this is a very important meeting, of course, where the results are handed over to the customer. Once the review meeting is completed, before we iterate back, there is yet another meeting called the retrospective, which is a very important meeting in which the team, together with the Scrum Master and the product owner, discuss what went well in the sprint and also what could be done better in order to improve. It's like a lessons learned meeting, but it's not at the end of the project. It's at the end of every single iteration. So as you can see, it really drills down and you can discuss things as related to ways of working, how can we collaborate better, and so on and so on. It's actually a very powerful event if it's done properly. So summarizing, 5 ceremonies, 3 artifacts. The 5 ceremonies are the sprint planning meeting, the daily scrum, the sprint itself, the review meeting, and the retrospective, while the artifacts are the product backlog, sprint backlog, product increment. In addition to the 3 roles that we said, the Scrum Master, the product owner, and the development team. So remember these different key elements of Scrum: the 5 ceremonies, 3 artifacts, and the 3 roles. Regarding the development team, we said it's a small number of people, and 5 to 12 people, and there are certain characteristics relative to the type of people that we want there. We've already talked about cross-functionalities, meaning that we want people with skill sets across the board who are able, therefore, to represent all the different skills that we need in the project. But there's also another characteristic, which is that T-shaped aspect. The T-shaped aspect means that in addition to having depth of expertise in one area, the team member also has a broad set of expertise, meaning they are able to back each other up. I might be an expert in one field, but I have a working knowledge of some of the other fields that I'm collaborating with. Therefore, I am able to back up some of my team members. If all of your team members are so-called T-shaped, meaning they have their own key skill, but they're able to back up the other team members, you're creating resilience within the team. You're taking in consideration the fact that uncertainties may occur in which the team needs to be able to back each other up in order to be able to be efficient. And thereby not having only experts in single fields that are not able to collaborate with each other or are not able to back each other up, you have instead some amount of resilience embedded in your team skill sets. Remember, therefore, the difference between the I-shaped and the T-shaped team members. And this Scrum lingo means having an expert in one field or having somebody who, in addition to the expertise, is able to back colleagues up. the T-shaped skill sets. I'd like to have a look a little bit as to how the Scrum work fits, or the Scrum process fits into the broader picture, and how the product is broken down to arrive to what the team actually does during the sprint. In particular, we start, of course, with the product roadmap. There is an idea of what needs to be delivered, and there might be a milestone by which we need to deliver it. Something like this, for example. We have a key release, a key milestone, in this case at the end of March, and this key release needs to have 3 specific features that are delivered. Each of those features will then be broken down into stories and tasks and things that we need to perform. And this might proceed, and the months afterwards we have another release with other features that need to be delivered with another milestone. And the idea, of course, is that we need to perform the most important and valuable elements in feature 1, 2, and 3 by the end of March, in the case of this first release, for example. And therefore, we don't want to have all of feature 1, very valuable elements, plus the less valuable elements completed. Maybe all of feature 2, valuable plus less valuable elements of feature 2, and maybe we're not able to do feature 3 because we don't have time by the end of March. The idea is that we will prioritize the most valuable elements in each 3 features, work on those, and if anything is not completed by the end of March, it should be the least valuable elements in the 3 features. This is the idea of focusing on value that we were talking about earlier, right? So a product roadmap looks like this. You might have different releases. You might even have additional topics that need to be delivered with other features, right? That have them maybe different milestones. So this is what a product roadmap looks like. But this product roadmap needs to be broken down, as we saw. So let's have a look at the product structure. The overall product, as we saw, is broken down into epics, these big chunk of work. When you hear the word epic, think big chunk of work. And these epics, as we've seen already in the roadmap, are broken down into features. And this is what we saw so far in the roadmap. However, in order to be operational, to be able to work, we actually need to break these features down into actionable elements. So we need to understand which characteristics of these features best serve our users. And that's what the stories are about, also known as user stories. So we'll be breaking down the user stories and understanding what it is that we need to actually implement, what the team will have to work on. And the team, of course, will be breaking those stories down into specific tasks, which then can be brought into the sprints and worked upon sprint by sprint. Obviously, we will be working on the sprints that are most valuable, on the tasks that are most valuable. So if we are working on one epic, for example, and we're starting with the features 1 and 2, we'll be focusing on the stories that are most valuable and focusing on the tasks that are most valuable first, and then we'll be moving to the stories that are less valuable as we proceed, right? So this is how the roadmap and the product structure fit together. But I'm talking about story, but what is a story? It might not be clear to you what we actually mean by a story. So let's have a look at what a story actually is. What is a user story? Well, a user story is essentially a card, a simple card which says something like, as who, what user am I? We want what is it that I want to obtain if I am the user? Because of why? Because what is the reason for which I want to obtain it, right? So there are these 3 parts to the user story. The role, who is the owner of the story? The goal, what is it that they want to accomplish? And the benefit, why is it that they want this goal? So these are the stories, the user stories. And we'll be breaking these down into tasks in order to then know what to do and what to perform. And the idea, of course, is that the user stories should be the big majority of stories that we work upon, but they are certainly not the only ones, right? We might have also something called a spike or an enabler, right, which is typically a prototype, right? An experiment that needs to be done might not have a specific user behind it, but the team knows that they need to perform that. And so it's useful to have a story which is dedicated to that, even if there is not a specific user behind it. Or technical debt, if we've taken a shortcut, we've fast-tracked, and now we need to go back and fix something that we skipped earlier. Or there is a defect, right? There's a bug, or there is some failure that we've had, and now we need to go back and fix it, right? These are all stories that may not have a specific user behind them, but there's still work that needs to be done, right? However, the idea is that the big majority of stories that you're working on are user stories, because otherwise the risk is that you drift away from bringing value to the customer. Now, which stories are to be worked upon? And how do we know when we've completed an iteration and the stories that are in it? And in Scrum, we call these concepts the definition of ready and the definition of done. So if we are looking at our sprint, for example, you are already familiar with this image. The definition of ready occurs at the very beginning of the sprint, and it is essentially the definition of the team that says which stories are ready to be brought into the sprint backlog from the product backlog. It's the team that decides what is ready to be worked upon. And if something is missing, of course, the product owner then needs to go back to the customer or to the business and integrate it. The definition of done indicates instead the other end of the sprint. It summarizes the acceptance criteria for each of the stories, clarifying when is it that the work is completed to be handed over to the customer. Definition of ready, definition of done. They kind of represent the gates of the iteration. Definition of ready represents the input gate to the iteration. Definition of done represents the output gate of the iteration. Now, these stories need to be measured. Otherwise, how can we track their progress? And to measure stories, we, in Scrum, don't use standard objective measurement criteria such as it takes 3 days or it costs €1,000. We use objective criteria such as days or money, right? But we use subjective criteria, which are meaningful to the team, but not necessarily meaningful beyond the team. And we'll quickly see why this is so. We call these story points. Essentially, instead of measuring days or money, we measure story points. It's an abstract unit of measure. Essentially, it's a measure that represents the overall complexity of a story. The complexity of the story includes not only how long an activity takes, but also how new it is, how difficult it is, how challenging it is, how risky it is, right? All these different elements would increase the complexity of an activity. And there are several ways of creating story points. I will give you 2 examples here, a simple one and a slightly more complex one. A simple one is simply using t-shirt sizes. Essentially, the team knows which activities are considered in their own experience relatively small, which ones are considered large, etc., and they use t-shirt sizes in order to give them a value. So instead of giving them this one takes 3 days, that one takes 10 days, they just say this one's small and that one's large, right? And they can, of course, then, if they need to quantify these, give a number to these values. Small equals 5, large equals 13, whatever. But the point is that these are fixed numbers, and so you don't worry about the detail behind them. You only worry about allocating it to one category of small, medium, large. And this category has meaning for the team, not necessarily beyond the team. What may be a small activity for one team might be a medium activity for another team. Another approach is called planning poker. Planning poker is a bit like a game, and it uses a series of numbers called the Fibonacci series, where each number is equal to the sum of the previous two, in order to give an ever-increasing amount of weight to bigger and more complex stories. So essentially, the team decides across these numbers what value to allocate to the story. Right? The story is presented, and they will give it a value 2, a value 8, a value 21. They will pick one of the numbers on the Fibonacci series to represent it, and that will be the number of story points of that story. This might sound confusing at the moment. Story points often are confusing if it's the first time that you've heard about them. Just let it sit there, let it sink in. The idea is that you want to embed the uncertainty of your estimates into the estimate itself. So every estimate, if I estimate that a certain activity is going to take 12 days, for example, has an error margin. It will be 12 days plus minus a certain error margin. If I am saying it's 21 on the Fibonacci series, it means I have an error margin between 13 and 34 already in there, if you follow me on the Fibonacci series. So the error margin is embedded into the evaluation that I'm making. Right? So much for story points. And what do we use these for? Well, we use them for many things, in particular for reporting. We report in Scrum using a thing called velocity. Velocity essentially indicates how much work a team is able to do in one sprint. And the way you calculate velocity is that, first of all, you sum up the number of story points that you're able to do in each sprint. By the end of the sprint, how many story points did we do for each of the stories? And then you make an average. On average, in each sprint so far, we've been able to do 100 story points. And that average is your velocity, is the velocity of that team. Remember that velocity is based on story points. Therefore, the velocity is also only meaningful within the frame of reference of the specific team. However, that's the story point. That's the story points, and that's the velocity of the team. Right? And how do we use this velocity? Well, here's an example. Imagine that we have a team that is working for several sprints, and it has a velocity of about 60 story points when things go well per sprint, and 40 story points when things don't go that well per sprint. So there's a certain margin here in the middle. So about 50 story points is the average. So the blue line that you see here will represent your expected amount of story points that you're able to perform per sprint, right? While the green and the yellow line represent the tolerance levels. So if, for example, I have 250 story points worth of work to do, I know that it will take me about 5 sprints with a certain variability around that. If, on the other hand, I need to know how much work I can do in 3 sprints, I will know that I will be able to do about 150 story points worth of work with a certain variability around that. Right? And at the same time, if somebody comes with a fixed amount that they request and they say, you have 2 sprints to do 200 story points worth of work, well, I will immediately know that that's not going to happen. Right? And that in reality, there will be some level of flexibility needed here. Either I can do 100 story points worth of work in the 2 sprints, or we will need 4 sprints to be able to do the full 200 story points. So this gives you a way to evaluate what is happening, and of course it also helps you then to track the actuals as they come in. So this is how you use velocity. In Scrum, we also use other charts to track the work that we are doing. In particular, we use, for example, burn down charts. Burn down charts represent the total amount of story points that we are going to do. In this example, 250 story points. And we track how many story points are still open after each day. So after the first day, we still have 240 story points open, and then so on and so on. So we can track the amount of story points still left open across the sprint and compare it to an ideal burn down amount and figure out if we are on track or if we are lagging behind. Of course, if by day 14 we are still at 200 story points worth of work left open, well, it's clear that we are lagging behind. Right? So this enables us to track. And this work of tracking the work that is being done day by day is done by the Scrum Master, and they collect the information during the daily stand-ups. These burn down charts are usually used to track the activity throughout a sprint, but we can use also a very similar logic, but the other way around, the burn up charts, in order to track activity throughout a whole release, throughout sprints. So, for example, if we know that a whole release is composed of 100 story points worth of work, then we can track our ideal progress, the green line, and our real progress, the orange line, as we proceed. Imagine that by the end of sprint 2, we realize that actually we were wrong. The work is 110 story points worth, so sprint 3, there you can see that the total amount is increased because the customer changed their needs or whatever. And now we can track how far we are actually going, how quickly we are able to adapt to that. And so you can track, at the end of the first sprint, we were lagging behind. At the end of the second sprint, we were still lagging behind. At the end of the third sprint, we were able to recoup something. And we can track how much work we are actually able to do throughout the arch of the whole release. So much for Scrum. We've seen the most important elements of Scrum. I hope that it was clear. I hope that you were able to take advantage of this. I'd like now to jump into hybrid approaches, understanding a little bit about what hybrid approaches are. And in particular, if we look at the whole spectrum of possible project management approaches, hybrid approaches are the ones there in the middle. While on one end we have the predictive approaches where planning is critical, and on the other end we have the pure adaptive approaches such as Scrum, for example, that I have just described to you. The hybrid approaches are there in the middle, where we use a little bit of one or a little bit of the other. And we can be combining the processes that we are using, the tools that we are using, the roles, or even simply the philosophy, the mentality of working. We can be combining different approaches to create hybrid approaches, right? So that's what hybrid approaches means. And let's have a look at a few examples of hybrid approaches, right? So, for example, you can have a hybrid approach where the whole project planning part, the initial stages of the project, are done in a predictive manner. We plan in detail what we are going to be doing, but then we use Scrum, for example, to roll out the execution, right? We have the plan is well made, is detailed, but then we break it down into small sub-projects, and each project is run by a Scrum team, and we roll out the execution using Scrum. That's one quite common hybrid approach. Another hybrid approach is that we have all along the life cycle a predictive approach, but only for the project management, only for the tracking, the reporting aspects, while the actual work is done by separate agile teams, separate teams that are working in Kanban or in Scrum. Right? That's another hybrid approach. Another approach could be that the whole work is being done in Agile, right? Maybe even in Agile at many different levels, but you have a project management office which backs up the Agile teams from the perspective of doing risk management, from the perspective of doing reporting towards upper management, for example. Right? Another approach could be combining a predictive approach with agile approaches by sub-projects. You have your whole project and some sub-projects are run in a traditional predictive way. Other sub-projects are run using Scrum or Kanban. A very common approach is this fifth one here, where you might have some predictive tools or some predictive reports in an agile context. Imagine I am running a work using Scrum, but then I decide that actually I want to have some risk management done on top of this. Scrum itself doesn't have a risk management process embedded in it because it's counting on the fact that the changes are absorbed by the process. Instead, I may decide that there is a business-related risks or whatever that I want to manage separately, so I will have my risk register, my risk management processes. That would be a predictive tool that I am using, and I'm using it on top of an agile approach. Or, for example, I have this last one is less common, but it can also occur, where you have your governance is managed using Agile, using, for example, a Scrum of Scrums type of approach, or using a SAFe or less approach, scaled Agile. But the actual deployment of the work is done using Agile or a predictive approach, or both. Right? So I might have waterfall in the single work that is being done, while instead I'm using a scaled agile approach to manage the overall approach. So these are examples, of course, of what type of hybrid approaches you could have. There could be many more, but this is the logic of what a hybrid approach actually means. And what type of things would you take in consideration when you're deciding what type of hybrid approach to use? Right? Well, first of all, of course, you'd be taking in consideration what is it that you're doing. You take in consideration the scope of work. What technology are you in? What industry are you in? You take in consideration your competing demands, the trade-off between time, scope, costs, risks, resources, quality, right? What is the trade-off between these? If scope is more relevant, of course, you'd go rather on the predictive end of the hybrid scale. If instead time is more relevant and schedule and meeting your milestones, you might stay on the more agile end of the scale. You take in consideration the culture of your organization. You take in consideration the relationship that you've built with your customer and with your suppliers, right? The more you are towards the agile approach, the more you need to be able to trust your customer, for example, because you are making yourself more and more vulnerable by being more and more flexible towards their needs. And very importantly, the 12 principles of the 7th edition of the PMBOK, which are the ones that you see down here. You'll be taking in consideration what type of relationship do I have with my stakeholders? What is the system like? What type of leadership capabilities do I have? What type of risks do I see? What type of resilience do I need to build? How do I need to be able to react to change? So these different principles, I'll be taking them in consideration in order to be able to choose what type of hybrid approach I'm going to use. So, with this, the last step of the presentation now relates to the benefits that agility might deliver. And here there is a little extract from the 14th state of Agile, where you can actually see how adopting Agile has actually been received. So, for example, the ability to managing to changing priorities is considered very important. The visibility of the project is considered very important. The alignment between business and IT is increasing very quickly. Your ability to deliver on time is also one of the top benefits. So there are quite a lot of important benefits that, if chosen in the right context, Agile is in effect able to deliver. And I want to look at a few key elements of benefits that are often delivered. The first one is, as I've mentioned already, the ability to focus on value. So focus on the value of what is actually going to be used, on getting feedback from the business and from the customer through the product owner, of leveraging the return on investment, both of the business and of the customer, and of creating value both for the customer and obviously for our own business. So these are the key objectives of focusing on value. And of course, value is therefore not doing the easiest things first, and it's not just doing whatever we've done in the previous projects or just any old sequence as long as we've started, right? So focusing on value, one of the key benefits of agility. Another one, of course, is the work done in an iterative approach. Delivering in increments, delivering a shippable product in iterative way, enabling therefore feedback from the customer. And typically we work in time boxes, meaning we have a clearly defined amount of time for different steps of our process. In particular, when we are talking about iterations, we say that the whole sprint is a time box, for example, a 2-week time box. And of course, the plans evolve based on the feedback that we get from the customer, creating continuous improvement this way. And that's another value coming from the iterativity that is generated through agility. Another important aspect that we've already mentioned are the self-organizing teams. And the self-organizing teams have many values, many advantages and benefits that they deliver, right? For example, self-organizing teams typically address issues together and therefore find find solutions that integrate different experiences and different expertise. They have some often higher self-investment in the work that is being done, therefore higher level of motivation. They tend to be more autonomous, and they need to be cross-functional in order to be able to be efficient. The next benefit that I want to mention, of course, is the shortening of the feedback cycle. It's connected to the iterations that we've mentioned earlier, right? In order to deliver value, we need to be able to address what the customer's needs are. And the only way to do that is to focus on the feedback that we get through each iteration from the customer. And this way, delivering what the customer actually wants rather than delivering what we thought the customer wanted at the beginning of the project when we defined the specs, instead of understanding what they want as we deliver throughout the project. So this is an overview of agility. I hope that you found it interesting and useful. Thank you very much for listening to me and for participating, and I wish you a lot of success in your Agile projects.